Okay, we are in the 11th chapter of the book of Romans. And for the first time, with the help of Mike, you remember the book that Steve Falconer gave me on rethinking Paul, and the material I got from N.T. Wright. I think I understand what Paul is saying here. And it is neither what the dispensationalists teach, that, you know, there's going to be a complete restoration of Israel with temple and everything, and nor is it what many evangelicals have believed about it. And I'm going to try to bring that out. The crux of the matter is when he says, and so all Israel will be saved. And if you do like so many people do, you just pick a verse, and if it sounds good, you put your weight on it. But that statement is made in a context, and it's a context that gives meaning to what all means there. And I hope we get to it this morning. I think we will. And I'll try to tie the loose ends. Okay. Let's start with the 11th verse of the 11th chapter. Sounds like our Mister's Day, doesn't it? I ask, therefore, have they stumbled and fallen in such a way that they can never rise? Absolutely not. Now, remember, God is the God of second chances. That's Max's phrase, and it is a very accurate description. He is saying, no way, absolutely not. Now, one of the things to remember is that Paul is, every place he teaches, all of his letters, there is only one way to be justified in the present age, and it's for both Jew and Gentile. So that's the first point to remember in this. He said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. See, there's just one gospel. There's just one way of being justified, and that is through faith in the work of Jesus Christ. The gospel, he says, consists of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And baptism gains its power to be an act of transition because it is the person's participation in and dramatically reenacting in his own body the symbol of death, burial, and resurrection to walk new life. And all of these things have to be kept in mind. The statements he makes here are not separate and contradictory to the statements he has already made. There is a consistency. There's been a tendency, even in fairly deep, important scholarship, to look at Paul piecemeal. And even some people have been so arrogant to criticize Paul for being obscure and disorganized, whereas the obscurity and the disorganization was in the eye of the beholder. because they were grinding special ideas that they assumed before they came to Paul. And if you come to the Bible with a previous agenda, you will find things that tend to support your agenda. You do that because you ignore or explain away any evidence to the contrary. So Paul is, and I'm learning this, he's one of the most powerful in argumentation person that I have ever read after. I have read some of the great philosophers, from Plato to Wittgenstein. And if you can read Wittgenstein, you can read anything. There's whole groups of seminars that spend their time trying to figure out what Wittgenstein meant.
Paul's very Aristotelian in his use of logic.
Yes, because he some way or other, either because he was taught it in the rabbinic school, or he read it or something, he was very much aware of Greek rhetoric. Now, he insists in 1 Corinthians that rhetoric is not the way to go, that it is the cross and Christ crucified, which is with the wisdom of God, but it's not the wisdom of men. Okay, he said, absolutely not, but their false step has resulted in the salvation of the Gentiles, so that it may provoke jealousy in them. Now, we've talked about this idea of provoking jealousy. Just being a Christian is not going to provoke jealousy in a Jewish person, a believer. But if you demonstrate that you know and understand the history of Judaism and are open to seeing it, as Paul says, he became a person who was under law when he was teaching people who are under the law. In other words, there's nothing better to reach a believing Jew than a demonstration of empathy, understanding, and empathy with the teachings in the Old Testament. And it helps too if you've got a little Talmudic influence, because it is so rare. Jews are so expectant that every Christian will jump on them with 2 feet and try to hook them with a meat hook, that the difference will be very apparent. And that is what you will provoke the envy or the jealousy that Paul is talking about here. And Paul did. As he said he became as someone under the law to people who were under the law, in order that he might convert or change them. And that's what it is. Not just being a Christian. It is being a Christian who knows and understands the Jewish viewpoint. I must confess that I'm not near as knowledgeable about the Talmud as I should be if I were going to be working with Jewish people. But if I were going to, I would, well, I'll tell you what happened in Washington, D.C. a mosque was built right across the street from the Falls Church building. And I went over and introduced myself to they called him the president of the mosque. And I happened to have an Arabic language New Testament. And I gave it to him in the name of the Falls Church. And he was so pleased with it. He said, I'll put this in our library. And he then, a week or two later, gave me a beautifully written and had, the dropped capitals with the fancy Quran. And he had to look a long time to get it because it's in Arabic on one side of the page and in English on the other. And the, Muslims simply do not encourage the translation of the what?
No, that is, yeah.
So
A lot of them don't even know what it says themselves. They just read it.
So he offered me something, and if we hadn't already intended to retire when I did, he offered me free Arabic instruction in their school. Now, that's the kind of thing that Paul is talking about here when he says to provoke the Jews into jealousy. See, by being open, with this fellow. In fact, the Oak Hills Church allowed them to use the parking lot of the church building on Friday night because there just wasn't enough room on that street to park, and they didn't provide for parking. And again, we had good relationships with them, and that's the way you do it. You can't expect a person, you slapping them in the face with a dead fish on one hand and trying to tell them about a loving Christ on the other. Somehow or other, that just doesn't compute. And we need to think about that. Let's go on then. In order to save as many of my kinspeople as I can. Now, kinspeople is not a dictionary word.
Where did you just go?
Yeah, where did you go?
Okay.
Yeah, verse 14. But it says what I want it to say. So the way I got to, keep the spell checker from telling me it's wrong every time, I just put it in the dictionary. I think I've got as much right to make up words as the next fellow.
Yeah.
Okay. For if their casting away results in the reconciliation of the whole creation to God. Now, this is another one of the unique teachings, not unique to Paul, but unique teachings of New Testament Christianity, is that the work of Christ was not just for human beings. It is in fulfillment of the language of Isaiah 65 and 66, where he says there will be a new heaven and a new earth. And Paul has already talked about that. And when he said in the 8th chapter that the creation was subjected to vanity, but it will be reconciled or made right when the sons or when the children of God are revealed in the last days. This is something that I discovered for myself in the early 1970s. And the first time I ever taught it publicly was at a meeting that we had downtown here in San Antonio and among all of the local churches of Christ. And I was teaching about heaven, and I pointed out that the Bible teaching is not that we go someplace, but that someplace comes to us. You go over and read in the 20th and 21st chapters of the book of Revelation, and I saw the heavenly Jerusalem coming down out of the heavens to earth. And it talks about a new heaven and a new earth. And that's something that will change. In my translation of the Gospel of Matthew, I have discovered something. I was not ever aware of it. I should have been, but I wasn't. You know, out of respect for Jewish sensitivities, Matthew does not call the kingdom of God. He calls it, in every English translation that I know of, the kingdom of heaven. And you cannot keep people from thinking that means in the heaven place where God dwells. That is totally a wrong translation. Every place it exists, it's in the plural. The kingdom of the heavens. It's not talking about that place that many of us think we're going to go to. It means, heavens in the plural means up there. That's all it doesn't have anything to do with the traditional view of heaven. That's one of the reasons I decided to translate. I don't know why. Every scholar that knows anything, every person who's had first year Greek will know that it's a plural. And tell me why. You can't, but tell me why people don't translate it.
So would it be better to say the kingdom of the universe?
No.
That's not true either?
No. Of the heavens, the sky.
Okay.
I did not quite have guts enough to translate it sky. I could justify that translation, but you know, there's going to be enough people upset by some of the translations I've made that there's no use rubbing salt in the wounds. But that is one that's important, because, as I say, you can tell people in a class, adults, that it's not talking about heaven, but they will always hear that it is. Jesse?
It seems like I'm associated with translations of the Jews sometimes say they use king of the universe.
Uh-huh.
And is that a parallel idea here, or?
No, he's that king because, as the Old Testament says, he is maker of heaven and earth. Of the heavens, by the way, it's plural in Hebrew too. The king is that way, he's by right of creation. But let's get back to this. I just want you to see what he's saying about here. What?
Oh, I was just going to ask. Doesn't kingdom in the biblical sense, isn't that have more to do with rule than it is a geographic or a place?
It is not a place. It means the rule of God. One of the best translations, and I'm not using it, but it would be the dominion of God.
Yeah.
And God wants, His will be done on earth and as it is in the heavens. By the way, it's plural there too. And that's...
Isn't that what God told Adam and Eve to? Take dominion of the earth?
Yes. That's the reason I like the word. It means rule. Okay, let's go on. If their casting away results in the reconciling the whole creation to God, what can their acceptance result in but life out of death? Now, whose life out of death?
Well, the death of the Jews, the current
Yes.
state of their unbelief and hardness.
Yes, that's
Their
that.
death.
Yeah, I wanted you to realize that he's talking about that. That if already the universe is being reconciled to God by the work of Christ, if they are added to, then it will result in their life
Right.
and not death. Okay. If the first fruits of the dough have been set apart for God, then the whole mass, I don't know why R is there. The whole mass is also set apart for God. This is very Jewish. See, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, even to this day, observant Jewish family, the children will go throughout the house and hunt up, and it's a game that some parents play. They hide bits of yeast in odd places, so that it's kind of like we hide Easter eggs and let them hunt it down. What he's saying is, if an initial activity is put into place, all the things that result from that initial activity will be made, the word holy, are set apart for God. Someday, and I probably never live to do it, I would like to make a study of the idea of holiness. It's a concept that is not as obvious as it ought to be. I realized that when I translated 1 Corinthians 7, where it says, if a woman is married to an unbelieving husband, and he is willing to stay with her, then stay married, because your children will be holy because of your influence on the family. And it seems to include the husband. And it does not mean, because Paul is so clear on this, it does not mean you're going to automatically save him because you're a believer. You have to believe for your own self. He goes ahead and said, then the whole mass is also set apart for God. If the root of the tree is set apart for God, the whole tree is also set apart for God. Because the tree gets its sustenance from the root. When you think about, and I saw it figured out one time, you have these big sequoia trees out in California, over 300 feet high, and water gets from the roots and other nutrients all the way to the top of that tree. It'd take a pretty good pump to pump it up there, but it's what they call osmotic pressure, different dilutions of liquid on different sides of a permeable membrane, and it goes all the way up to the top. And so pretty powerful. And always think about that when I read this section of Romans, that as the root is, so is the tree. I remember in the second grade, with my little hatchet on the school ground, I cut down a tree. about this big. My punishment was to memorize Joyce Kilmer's poem, The Trees, and recite it in front of the class. I think I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. For poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. Now, if you don't think that's going back a long way, 1935. I can still remember that. It's a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed to earth's sweet breast, and something about birds make a nest in her hair. It goes on. You see, I only remember part of it. Okay. Some of the branches have been broken off, and you Gentiles, although you were only wild olive trees. Now notice, Paul is a very subtle and emphatic teacher here. He introduces the idea of the root and the tree. And then that leads him in the next paragraph to use the root and the tree analogy to demonstrate the relationship of Jews and Gentiles in the salvation history. Remember, we are not talking about individual salvation. This is the holy history, the narrative story of the way God acts in life. Individual salvation is due to individual choices and individual relationships to God. And so keep that in mind. He's talking about groups of people. He's talking about races, cultures, ethnic groups. Although you were only a wild olive tree. Now, there are wild olive trees, and their fruit is so bitter that you cannot eat them, even if you try every known way to. But they were domesticated, I don't know, 5,000 years ago or something, and ancestors were pretty good in doing things like this, and they gradually hybridized a plant that the fruit is not all that bitter. You get an unripe olive, and it's still awfully bitter. And so he's talking about that, about grafting to the root. You have been grafted in their place. As a result, you're now sharing the same living sap from the same root. Now, that is, we as Gentile believers are still being dependent on the fact that the Jews rejected the Messiah, and we were grafted in their place. Now, that is so foreign to so many, or I'd say most believers today, because we are, the church is overwhelmingly non-Jewish believers. Overwhelmingly so. I mean, you take where the church is, where belief in Christ is growing the fastest in sub-Saharan Africa. I've shared this statistic with you. It is the best estimate about religious sociologists is that in sub-Saharan Africa, that's down below the Sahara Desert, the average of 10,000 people a day
Wow.
are being converted.
Wow.
Also, It's one of the most persecuted places. You just take the thing that's going on in northeastern Nigeria right now. That's very common. And I remember my uncle, who's passed on, years ago, he was an elder in the church at Roswell, New Mexico. And a missionary came by wanting support to go to Africa. And his argument with when they discussed it among the elders in the church, that he wanted to support missionaries to Africa so they could come back and convert his grandchildren. And
Prophetic, huh?
yes, yeah. He was really a great guy. Anyway, this idea is we have been grafted in, and we are life-giving sap. Now, that's sap is what you call the juice in a tree, like maple. Have you ever seen sugar maples being tapped? There's nothing much better than to go and get some maple syrup just as they take it out of the big boiling vat. Or, the kids love this, you take a little of that syrup as it's making and you pour it on a clean bank of snow. And then then you have a snow cone, a maple flavored snow cone. But this is the kind of, since this, there should be this is now, there should be an is there. This is now your spiritual state. You should stop acting superior to the root, because the root, it is the root that is supporting you and not you supporting it. The first believers were Jews. Every one of the apostles were Jews. And horror of horrors, Jesus was a Jew.
What about Adam and Eve? Were they Jewish?
No, there were no Jews
I know.
until Abraham.
That out. Because there was no priesthood or whatever.
What?
Because there wasn't a priesthood.
Well, God had not
Selected
selected.
the Jews.
Yeah.
Okay.
Paul he makes arguments based on that.
So were they Gentiles, I guess?
Well, since there were no Jews, there were no Gentiles.
Okay. They were just people.
It was just all people. God chose the Jews to undo the damage done to the human race by Adam. And they failed to do that. And the second Adam came and accomplished that, of undoing what was brought into the world by Adam. But, yes.
I've been wanting to work this in. And maybe now this would be a good opportunity, but I only know what I read.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I have read that the sequoias, because of their unusual height, the only way they can stay upright is because of the root system.
Yeah.
That is all entwined. And this made me think of that. The root is supporting the trees. keeping them up.
Literally supporting the tree. Well, that's true of most trees. When we moved,
Yeah, I was just going to say, the other interesting thing about a sequoia, I think, is their pine cone is very, very small, and it takes an intense heat for it to open up, for it to even begin to sprout.
yes, the reason that is, the mama tree or the papa tree, whichever one you want to call it, secretes a hormone that's an anti-growth hormone and won't let the seeds propagate. Yeah. Adele. I was going to say something else, and I can't remember now. Your comment was better than mine anyway. So, okay, we're going on. Therefore, you should say, branches have been broken off so that I may be grafted in. Now, that's directed to you and me, folks. And it was especially true. You remember we've talked about the anti-Semitism of the Jewish rulers. Claudius had, I believe it was Claudius, who had thrown all the Jews out of Rome. And that attitude was too much in the Roman church. And Paul wants to make sure that the Gentiles and the church at Rome recognize their debt to the Jews that went before. And we need to do that. I've told you about my friend Rabbi Stahl. I found out the other day he's still alive. He's 97 or something like that. I thought he had been dead for years. And if I knew, I don't know where he lives even. Probably in a Jewish rest home, but somebody that knew him even better than I did. We weren't really close friends, but we were more than acquaintances. We worked together in several projects. And he was a fine gentleman. And we need to cultivate our relationship to other ethnic groups, especially the Jews, because they were there first. And our standing with God has come about because of their rejection. You say, well, they rejected it, they deserve it. Paul didn't see it that way. Of course, he was a Jew. But you know, he's been accused of being anti-Jewish. A lot of scholars have accused him of that. Nearly all of them in the Lutheran tradition. And it's noted for being anti-Semitic. And that's not just a criticism of Lutheran, it's a fact that even most Lutherans would admit to. The great theological word book of the New Testament, 16 big volumes or something? It's one of the great results of scholarship, New Testament scholarship or Old Testament word studies that I know of. And yet it has to be used with great care because it's anti-Semitic to the root.
In the educational system, when my father told me a story that he had a class in high school where the teacher verbally abused him by saying his last name in a very disgusting voice. And he never knew whether it was his German heritage or the root of his name. Mm-hmm. And so even up till my dad's era, anti-Semitism was very... Well,
it was rampant in this country in the 30s, and in certain circles still is. Okay. True enough, it was because of their unbelief they were broken off. It is also because of your faith that you now have a standing with God. Now, he doesn't want to overdo this. Paul is being very specific and very careful. He wants them to remember that it was because of unbelief that they were broken off, and that resulted in something. The Jews didn't reject the Messiah, Christ, in order for Gentiles to become God's people. That was just that's a unintended result. And he, again, notice how he keeps coming back to this idea that it is belief or unbelief that separates people from those who believe are the people of God, believe in Christ, believe in the gospel. Those that don't believe are not the people of God. And notice how he just throws that in. And if people that would, we're going to get down to the all Israel. We may get there today, I don't know.
Charles, this reminds me of when Jesus told the parable about the man who threw the big party and invited all of his friends and everybody to come, and they wouldn't come, they made excuses. So he said, well, just go out in the streets and start inviting all those people. And when he told that parable, the leaders that were around got very offended.
Mm-hmm.
They went off and plotted some more because they understood what he was saying.
Yep.
If you don't come, we're going to let all those people you call unclean and Gentile come in.
Yes.
Have the party.
Yeah.
He was already talking about this.
Oh yeah. There's several places where he foreshadows the Gentile mission. Not in any direct teaching, but like you say, in parables and things like that, he does. Don't be arrogant about this, but rather be fearful. You should act this way because God did not spare the natural branches, and neither will he spare you. Take notice of the goodness and severity of God. I'm sure you've heard sermons on that passage. I've preached sermons on it and was totally using it out of context. And this is very tempting in younger preachers and older ones too, is to generalize. And statements like this are within a rational argument, and they are not general statements. Now, it is true that God is both good and severe, but this passage is not talking about it in general. It's talking about it in a specific way about the Jews and the Gentiles. That's what he's talking about. He was severe toward those who fell, but he will be good toward you if you continue steadfastly in his goodness. That D should be an S. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. Now, again, he's not talking about individual salvation, but he's talking about the general thing, that if general... Now, in our country today, there is a growing number of people who once were, their families once were strong in the faith, and now they are at best agnostic about it. And in fact, for the first time in the history of this country, the people who go to church regularly are in the minority. Now, I won't say the first time. Tell you a little statistic that I ran across when I was taking restoration history. In when the American Revolution broke out, what percentage of people do you think regularly attended church?
23.
What?
23%.
Yes. You read the same book I did. I told you the same. 23% is all it was. Now, that didn't mean that the people who didn't attend church didn't have some modicum of faith, but they just didn't work at it. And we had the Second Great Awakening. Started with the Cane Ridge meeting in Kentucky, where you've heard the song, "Give Me That Old Time Religion." Mm-hmm. Well, that was talking about the religion that was preached at the Cane Ridge Church in 1803. And it wasn't, it says it's good enough for Paul, and it's good enough for Silas, it's good enough for me. The problem is it wasn't even around so that Paul and Silas could believe it. There's a lot of people profess, being like Paul, and they are not. But he's warning here that if Gentiles as a group or any group of Gentiles become unbelievers, they too will be cut out. And again, this is not individual salvation. Individual salvation depends on individual choices and belief, or individual choices of unbelief. But this is the history of things, and Paul's warning Gentiles. That means that even though we are saved, this message is kind of to us. That is, there's always the possibility that our descendants will no longer believe, just like my uncle predicted in talking about African missionaries. Let's go on. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. Also, any Jews who do not continue in their unbelief will be grafted in again. Now see, he gets to individual belief. Any Jews who give up their unbelief will be grafted back in. Now, I want to make a generalizing statement here because our time is just about up. I think that the closest thing in our present day religious world to Jewish salvation is in what we call the Jews for Jesus movement. When Max took the group to Israel, they met a prime example of that. His name is Joseph Shulam, and he has almost single-handedly converted quite a few Jews. I don't know where he got his teaching, but I know that he did, and he and Max are good friends. I only met him one time. He visited the United States and preached at Oak Hills. And I know that Max was looking forward to seeing him again. Now, I have some Jewish friends that attend over at where the old church building, the old Oak Hills building was. And I think that they are believing Jews who've been grafted back in. Now, that is the hope of Jews. We're not going to get down to all Israel today, but we will next week.